Iran is burning, streets flooded with rage, bazaars shut, chants turning into demands for overthrow. Thousands are allegedly dead. And then came Washington. Donald Trump thundering threats, help is on the way, war talk everywhere, US assets repositioning, fighter jets moving, personnel pulled out, Iran closing airspace, the region holding its breath. For days it looked like history was about to repeat itself. Protests inside, pressure outside, regime change loading. Everyone expected the switch to flip. Everyone waited for the strike. And then nothing. No bombs, no missiles, no invasion. Just sanctions. Hard sanctions, yes, but still sanctions. So what slammed the brakes on a moment that looked primed for explosion, and why does Saudi Arabia or the Arab world sit at the center of that answer? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. Iran is facing its largest uprising since 1979. The US publicly backs protesters. Trump threatens action. Military assets repositioned defensively. Allies evacuate. Analysts whisper timelines. And yet, the White House steps back from kinetic war. Instead, Treasury rolls out sanctions targeting IRGC commanders, security officials, and energy-linked companies across Iran, the UAE, Singapore, and the UK. Gulf diplomacy goes into overdrive. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Oman, Egypt all rush to cool things down. So why, when Iran looked weakest, did Washington suddenly choose restraint, and whose interests were really being protected? Let's be clear about what actually happened. The United States did not launch an attack on Iran. There were no B-2 bombers crossing red lines, no strike packages advancing. What did happen was precautionary repositioning. KC-135 tankers surged through Hawaii and Diego Garcia. Surveillance drones appeared near Iran's coast. Non-essential personnel were evacuated from regional bases. Britain followed suit. Iran briefly shut its airspace. Threats were exchanged, but the posture stayed defensive. Analysts saw signaling, not invasion, pressure, not ignition, and that distinction matters. At the same time, Trump's rhetoric was unmistakable. He urged Iranians to keep protesting. He warned Tehran against executions. He promised consequences. His administration openly weighed options: airstrikes, cyber operations, economic pressure. The message was sharp. The regime was on notice. But the execution was restrained. Instead of missiles, Trump reached for sanctions, heavy, targeted, punitive sanctions.
My message today is to the Iranian leadership on behalf of the people of Iran who cannot speak for themselves. Last March, we predicted that President Trump's maximum pressure campaign against the Iranian regime would accelerate an economic collapse. Since then, our sanctions efforts have been effective in slashing oil exports and cutting revenue. The currency and living conditions are in freefall. The early warning signs are already flashing in the Iranian economy. The regime continues to egregiously mismanage its economic resources with additional subsidies and price controls. The central bank is broke and printing money. Hyperinflation is next. Rather than building a prosperous Iran, the regime has chosen to squander what remains of the nation's oil revenues on nuclear weapons development, missiles, and terrorist proxies around the world. Civilians are rightly protesting mismanagement and economic collapse. President Trump stands with the people of Iran and has ordered Treasury to sanction members of the regime. Iran's leaders have brutally responded to peaceful demonstrations with violence, from mass shootings in the street to attacks on wounded victims in hospitals. Today's sanctions target 18 individuals and entities that the regime uses to evade sanctions on Iranian oil and divert proceeds from its energy sales away from the rightful owners, the Iranian people. Tehran's natural resources belong to its people and not its brutal dictators. Treasury will continue to target Iranian networks and corrupt elites that enrich themselves at the expense of average Iranians. This includes the regime's attempts to exploit digital assets to evade sanctions and finance cybercriminal operations. Additionally, President Trump has announced a 25% tariff on countries that continue to do business with Iran. Our message to the Iranian people is clear. Your demands are legitimate. You are protesting for a noble cause, and the United States supports you and your efforts to peacefully oppose the regime's mismanagement and brutality. Our message to the Iranian leaders is also clear. U.S. Treasury knows that like rats on a sinking ship, you are frantically wiring funds stolen from Iranian families to banks and financial institutions around the world. Rest assured, we will track them and you, but there's still time if you choose to join us. As President Trump has said, stop the violence and stand with the people of Iran.
The Treasury Department rolled them out fast. Senior IRGC commanders, security officials tied to the crackdown, energy traders, shipping networks, oil-linked companies, entities registered not just in Iran, but in the UAE, Singapore, and the UK. The message was economic suffocation, not military shock. This wasn't regime change by force. It was regime pressure by blockade. Why? Because military strikes, as Lisa Curtis put it, could backfire. A strike could unify the regime. A strike could derail protests. A strike could trigger regional retaliation. A strike could spiral. Sanctions, on the other hand, keep pressure high while avoiding immediate blowback. That was the public logic. But the private logic was louder, and it came from Riyadh.
Yes, that does seem to be the focus of the Trump administration now. And I know that could impact India, because India does have some trading relations with Iran. India invests in the Chabahar port in Iran, so there could be an impact on India-Iranian trade, as well as many other countries. So I think the economic pressure is what President Trump seems to be focusing on at the moment, because again, the military option could badly backfire and would not really help the protesters in any meaningful way. So I think the focus now is on economic pressure on the regime, trying to get information in and out of Iran through different ways, and making sure that the protesters know that the United States supports them and what they're trying to do. But it's going to be tough. There's a severe crackdown on the Iranian protesters, and the sense is that things will likely only get worse for those protesters.
Saudi Arabia on paper should have been cheering. Sunni versus Shia, decades of rivalry, proxy wars, ideological hostility. If Iran's regime collapses, Saudi power expands. That's the textbook assumption. But the reality of 2026 doesn't follow textbooks. It follows oil prices. It follows deficits. It follows solvency. Here's the number that explains everything. $44 billion. That's Saudi Arabia's fiscal hole. At current prices, the Saudi welfare state is already strained. Under $94 a barrel oil, the math breaks. At $60, it hurts. At $40, it collapses. And Iran is the wild card that can shove oil straight off a cliff. If Iran's sanctions are lifted, or if regime change brings Iran back online, 160 million barrels of Iranian oil sitting in floating storage hit the market immediately. Then comes an extra 1 to 2 million barrels per day of production. That flood pushes oil from $60 to $40. For Saudi Arabia, that isn't pain, that's insolvency. Normally, Saudi Arabia would cut production to defend prices, but 2026 is not normal. A wall of new suppliers crashing in, 1 million barrels per day of new oil, all cheaper than Saudi barrels. Break-even prices hovering at $35 to $45. If Riyadh cuts, it doesn't save prices. It just hands market share to competitors. That's the trap. Saudi Arabia cannot cut. Saudi Arabia cannot absorb $40 oil. And Saudi Arabia cannot survive a sudden Iranian return to the market. So Riyadh doesn't want an Iran war because war risks chaos. And it doesn't want an Iran peace because peace risks oil collapse. What Saudi Arabia needs is a sanctioned Iran, isolated, offline, frozen in place. This has nothing to do with Sunni versus Shia, nothing to do with ideology, and everything to do with balance sheets. Solvency versus bankruptcy. The enemy of my sanctioned enemy is still my enemy. That's why Saudi Arabia allegedly refused US overflight access. That's why Gulf capitals panicked. That's why Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia launched what officials called a long, frantic, last-minute diplomatic push. They weren't defending Tehran, they were defending themselves. They warned Trump about blowback, about retaliation, about US bases in their countries being hit, about the Strait of Hormuz, about oil chaos, about regional instability, and Trump listened. Arab governments now openly say tensions have de-escalated. Talks may continue. Assets repositioned back. Iran reopened airspace. The strike didn't come. The sanctions did. Trump's decision wasn't softness. It was calculation. He kept his finger over the button, as officials admit. Military options remain live. But for now, the cost-benefit didn't add up. And history backs that pattern. Trump threatens big. He escalates rhetorically. He uses unpredictability as pressure. But he prefers low-risk move unless escalation is cheap. Sanctions are cheap. Bombs are not. Look at Venezuela. Look at Iran before. Trump talks diplomacy, then strikes. Or talks strikes, then pauses. The common thread isn't ideology. It's leverage. Right now, sanctions give Trump leverage. War would give Iran excuses. War could rescue the regime from its own collapse by turning protesters into foreign agents. Sanctions keep the economic vice tight without handing Tehran that narrative. A regional war would detonate oil markets in unpredictable ways. A regime collapse could unleash Iranian supply like a tsunami. Both outcomes are existential threats to Saudi finances. So Riyadh leaned hard on Washington. Trump, who prides himself on deal-making, heard the message. Strike now and you destabilize everything. Sanction now and you control the tempo. That's why Treasury sanctions rolled out instead of tomahawks. That's why IRGC commanders were targeted on paper, not in the air. That's why energy traders got blacklisted instead of bombed. Publicly, the US says it stands with the Iranian people. Privately, it's walking a tightrope, squeezing the regime without blowing up the region. And Saudi Arabia? It holds leverage not because it loves Iran, but because it fears oil math more than Iranian slogans. So how much hold does Saudi Arabia have over Trump administration? Enough to stop a war. Enough to reroute history from missiles to sanctions. Enough to prove that in 2026, oil prices can outweigh ideology, morality, and even regime change fantasies. Iran is still burning, protests still simmer, sanctions still bite. The military option still hangs in the air, but the pause tells a brutal truth about global power. Revolutions don't just rise or fall on streets, they rise or fall on spreadsheets. And right now, Saudi Arabia's balance sheet is louder than Iran's burning streets. That's the uncomfortable reality behind the headlines. The world saw protests, tanks repositioning, threats flying, and assumed momentum was irreversible. But momentum in geopolitics is fragile. It bends to money, it bends to oil, it bends to allies who whisper consequences instead of shouting slogans. Because if US planes strike Iran, retaliation doesn't land in Washington. It lands in Riyadh, Doha, Abu Dhabi, Manama. It lands on oil facilities, on ports, on shipping lanes, on economies already stretched thin. Saudi Arabia knows this, the Arab world knows this, and Trump knows Saudi Arabia knows this. That's why the Gulf message was unified. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, Egypt, Turkey, different interests, same fear. A strike might feel decisive, but it opens doors nobody can close. Oil shocks, base attacks, regional fires, and possibly a united Iran that the West doesn't want. Because nothing rescues a cornered regime like a foreign attack. Bombs don't weaken crackdowns, they justify them. They don't empower protesters, they bury them under nationalism and emergency laws. Gulf leaders understand this calculus better than Washington ever could. So the argument wasn't just don't attack, it was don't make it worse. Don't turn Iran's internal collapse into its external salvation. Trump listened not because he suddenly turned cautious, but because the risks aligned against action. Saudi Arabia didn't ask for peace, it asked for paralysis. Keep Iran sanctioned, keep it isolated, keep it bleeding slowly, not exploding violently. And that explains the strange middle ground we are stuck in. No war, no peace, no regime change, just pressure. Sanctions layered on sanctions. Diplomacy hinted at, never embraced. Threats recycled, not executed. And make no mistake, sanctions are not mercy. They're slow violence, economic suffocation, isolation by paperwork, pressure without spectacle. For Trump, this also fits his pattern. Maximum noise, maximum uncertainty, minimum immediate risk. Threaten big, pause publicly, keep everyone guessing. For Saudi Arabia, it's survival strategy. Delay Iran's return, delay oil collapse, buy time with bonds, asset sales, and scaled-back dreams. For people in Iran, it could very well be betrayal by America. Enough US pressure to provoke crackdowns, not enough to break the system. Enough hope to rise, not enough to support win. And that is the real cost of de-escalation. Not peace, not stability, but suspension. A frozen conflict where everyone waits and people on the ground pay the price. So when people ask why Trump stopped at sanctions, the answer isn't hesitation. It's calculation shaped by oil, allies, and fear of unintended consequences. The Arab world didn't save Iran, it saved itself. And in doing so, it helped decide the limits of American power without firing a single shot. Because in 2026, wars aren't stopped by morality, they're stopped by markets. Iran may be burning, but oil still rules. And as long as Arab nations' balance sheets depend on a sanctioned Iran, regime change will remain a headline, not a reality. So while it's still early to say if and when America strikes Iran, we certainly will be watching whether this pause is the end of escalation or just the silence before the next move. Thank you for watching Statecraft.